There we go. Perfect. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Trigger Warning. We're back in the studio after a long layoff, and we're back in with something very, very different. Tonight, I'm pleased to announce we're hosting a debate on trans rights, women's rights, and everything around those issues. Just before I bring the participants in, there's just a couple of things I'd like to go over. My purpose tonight is simply to moderate the debate, help it along, keep everything on track, nothing more, nothing about my opinions or how I feel about any of this. Secondly, it's a conversation about ideologies. It's very easy to get heated and get carried away. Can I remind everybody that, you know, we're not on Twitter now. There's a person at the end of this. Be as respectful as you can be for the duration. Afterwards, fill your boots. But while we're doing it, let's try and keep it all together. Okay, Sam, to bring in. First participant is Sarah Phillimore from WeAreFairCop. Hello, Sarah. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks.
Good. And next one is Ashley Routh, a UK-based trans activist. Hello, Ashley.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going super. How are you?
Not bad. I've had a whole lot of nothing today.
Oh, that's an ideal day then. An ideal day. I know we've spoken between the three of us how this is going to commence. We're going to do some steel manning, which is where each participant gives what they believe to be the concise overview of what their opponent's point of view, beliefs, everything else are. Now, I did toss a coin for real, and the person going first will be Ashley. So, Ashley, please, floor is yours to steelman Sarah.
Sure. So I think WeAreFairCop. I think it's fair to say that you're a gender critical organisation. I think that's what I've seen them describe themselves as. From my experience, a lot of gender critical people have approached sort of women's rights politics from a sort of time that was slightly before me. So sort of there's a lot of people who were very active in the 70s and the 80s that were part of a lot of the fundamental fights for women's rights. And I think a lot of gender critical people are worried because trans rights is, for them, a relatively new conversation. And I think they're a bit concerned about how that might affect women's rights, which they've obviously fought for and been quite protective of. And I think that's often led a lot of gender critical people to believe a lot of things about trans activists, some of them true, some of them perhaps not quite so representative of the group.
Dude, great. I'm back up with my up. Good. I wasn't sure. I couldn't see. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Ashley. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks. I wrote this down because I wanted to get it right, because obviously I think it's really important in this whole good faith perspective to set that stage. So this, I had to think about it, and this is how I think the people I'm arguing with, trans people, see the issues. That gender arises from an innate sense of self that it's hard to articulate. We've developed a rich culture about what it means to be a man or a woman. They're no longer purely biological terms. There's a social aspect to being a man or a woman. And for some, it's not even about claiming man or woman. It's about rejecting those terms outright. For example, non-binary people reject stereotypes foisted on them. They don't want to be identified by what people perceive them to be based on their biology. So it's about how we define ourselves and how others should respect that as a fundamental human right. It doesn't take rights away from others if you have and assert an identity. The majority of trans people are sincere in their wish to be the opposite sex. They're not setting out to deceive. And many will have felt this urge from a young age. They'll always have felt miserable and uncomfortable with the gender that others assigned them. And biology is messy. Most trans people accept that sex is a real thing, but that someone's genitals should not be what defines them. And they don't think the distinction between sex and gender is important.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, you've both given your opinion of how the other side thinks, yet I think it's fair to say there has been no common ground in recent times. And what I'd like you to perhaps go around first is where exactly your viewpoints diverge so greatly that you would resort to perhaps some histrionics online and things of that nature. Who'd like to jump in first?
Okay, I'll jump in first because I think the stumbling block, I like to think myself as somebody who's able to conduct themselves fairly well online, although I can get a bit sarcastic. I hope I've never been outright abusive. But whenever I've tried to enter into a conversation, it just stops dead at the phrase, trans women are women. And that's the stumbling block for me. That's the line in the sand, that sex and gender are different and sex really matters, particularly for women. I mean, my focus will be unashamedly the whole trans women versus women issue. Trans men, I think, is a whole different issue, and it's up for men to say if they find that threatening or invasive of their spaces. But women definitely do, because it's not creepy for us to be concerned about the genitals of another person. It's what we have to do to stay alive. I mean, that doesn't sound hysterical, but when you look at the rates of physical and sexual attack on women by men, well, they're a lot higher. So I find it's really frustrating because I can't get beyond that simple point. And I'm quite prepared to accept gender is completely different. Gender is your expression of how you see yourself, how you'd like others to see yourself. And I'm quite prepared to accept that there are men who want to be seen as women. And I'll call them she and her. You know, if they commit to the surgery, I'd be a lot less worried about them being in particular spaces. But when I'm faced with, say, an Alex Drummond, a man with a beard and a penis who says, I'm a woman and I'm a lesbian, that's where the shutters come down for me. And I've never been able to get anyone to actually start engaging with me, because all I get is trans women are women, trans women are women. I mean, you see that all over Twitter, quite respectable charities like Amnesty. It's not an argument. It's a literal bludgeoning with words, and it doesn't help. And what it means is that me and Ashley are stuck on the side of a divide, screaming at each other. And just, where is this going to go? Because I'm not going to change my mind. Ashley's not going to change her mind. So that's why I really wanted to take this chance to come off Twitter, because it's performative, it's limiting. I think it's driving people mad, and it's not helping. We need to be able to talk about this. I think Ashley's point about the 70s and 80s was a brilliant point. I was a teenager in the 80s. I first became aware of the whole trans issue when I read Caroline Cossey's book. Now, she is a beautiful woman. And a picture I saw of her as a Bond girl, she still had a penis. But she was a beautiful woman. And she couldn't get married because she was a man. I was thinking as a teenager, well, that's outrageous. Why can't she get married? So that was the 80s. And I think a lot of people haven't realised how much it's changed now, in that queer theory has taken over, and very visible men with very visible penises are saying, I'm a woman, let me in. And women, we're saying no, and particularly those of us who are a bit older, those of us who did grow up in the 70s and 80s. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on too
That's
much.
Okay. Everyone can have a couple of minutes to talk. Otherwise, again, it's not Twitter. We can relax into this.
We need to move
Ashley,
beyond trans women are women and deal, I think, with that.
Okay, Ashley.
So I want to rewind a little bit to the start of what you said about Alex Drummond. I've never actually thought about pronouncing Alex's surname. I think Drummond is right. And about this idea about transitioning and surgery and things like that. I think it's valid, although I think it opens an interesting logical discussion. For example, let's take Alex Drummond as an example. You referenced Alex having a beard, and that's obviously quite a well-regarded kind of male sex characteristic, but it's not kind of unique in that sense. There are women that can grow them, and I appreciate that Alex is trans and it's slightly different. But my point is that if we use these kind of visible physical characteristics to express somebody making us uncomfortable, then you kind of have to take that down the line a little bit and see that has to or must eventually lead to women, that's cis women, trans women, being judged based on their appearances, and if they appear too masculine in any way, not just a beard, but generally, that they're suddenly being criticized or being questioned or being asked to identify themselves. There are cases where this has actually happened in real life now. There are a few cases where cis women have been followed into toilets, sometimes by men, and challenged on their identity, and even thrown out of shops or out of malls because they somebody believes that they might be a man or trans, and isn't happy with them in that space and gets them thrown out because they are not able to identify themselves in a meaningful way as woman or not willing to. And I think it opens an interesting discussion because like the toilet debate is, for me, it doesn't even necessarily have to be about ideology. I don't think it necessarily, or it certainly doesn't only have to be a question about what you're comfortable with. It's more a question of what's actually practical, what's enforceable. Like if you said trans women have to use the men's toilet and trans men have to use the if trans men have to use the women's toilet and trans women have to use the men's toilet, then how would you actually enforce that? Like, I don't agree with that as an idea, but like, I don't think that really matters because I don't think it's realistic. It's more realistic for some spaces than others. Like prisons is kind of, I think, a different discussion to toilets, and it's a different discussion to sports. I think those are all things that are enforced differently and apply differently, but on purely like practical basis, I think a lot of women's spaces by de facto function on self-ID because it's not possible to ID people. And so I don't think that argument really, like, however, whether you feel comfortable or don't feel comfortable with trans women in women's toilets, I don't know how you could practically enforce that. And I think that a big part of the disagreement, like, it almost seems kind of irrelevant to discuss what does and doesn't make you comfortable if there isn't really a practical answer to it. You know, like I'm uncomfortable that in theory, if I'm out at night alone, somebody could attack me and there's probably nothing I could do about it. That's the thing that makes me uncomfortable. There isn't really anything I can do about it. That's kind of just the nature. It's the social contract, right? Anyone could, in theory, attack anyone. And the social contract is that we don't. I don't think it's necessarily actually very realistic to try and enforce a lot of these ideas that a lot of people are promoting. And I think there's probably an interesting conversation to be had there, because if it's not enforceable, then I'm not sure what we're really working towards.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that Ashley says I agree with. I know that women can have beards, a few of them. I'm polycystic ovary. If I didn't tweeze, I'd probably have quite a respectable beard. I'm not in favour of people being hounded out of spaces because they look different. But I am worried at this constant deflection of the argument back to toilets. You can't enforce it and we just want to pee. I agree with you. We can't enforce it. Toilets operate on convention. People go into the disabled toilets. I'm disabled. They go in, they chance it. They think they can get away with it. And sometimes there's social stigma. If I see them, I might have a go at them. But, you know, they do it because they can get away with it and they're desperate. I've nipped into the men's toilets when I've been desperate. I really hated it. Nipped in, nipped out really quickly. So, yeah, you're quite right. That is unenforceable. We're not having somebody on the door saying, checking your pants. But the argument does seem to just polarize around toilets like it's a gotcha. You can't stop us. What's the point? And men will hurt you anyway. It doesn't matter if it's in the toilet or outside. So I'd like Ashley to think about this, because this is a question I put to a lot of people on Twitter, because I think it's really interesting. And if you don't know, Google Kimberly Nixon, because this explains, I think, why the Vancouver Rape Centre has been so targeted by trans activists in Canada. They really, really hate it. And I think it's because of the Kimberly Nixon case. Now, Kimberly Nixon was a trans woman who wanted to train and be a counsellor for women who had been raped. And the Vancouver Rape Crisis Centre said, no, the women who've been raped don't want you. You were born a man. Sorry, that's the way it is. And Kimberly Nixon took them to court and she lost. Now, I always ask people who come back at me with the toilet example, and I think, to be fair to you, Ashley, you did accept that there's another conversation to be had about prisons and sports. But I'm just asking you here and now, do you think Kimberly Nixon ought to have been allowed to be a rape counsellor? Because this is where I think the rubber hits the road. This is where you can't just say it's a bit creepy to think about someone's genitals. And I have to say, I have been really shocked and upset by the way some people dismiss this example as though the trauma of those women is nothing and the dignity of the trans woman was everything. So I'd just be interested. I think I probably have to agree with you on toilets. It's not enforceable. But what do you think about the Kimberly Nixon example I give?
Sure. So I've not heard Kimberly Nixon's name before, actually. So I just want to make sure I've got the the fact of this right. So she is a trans woman. She's presumably trained as a counsellor.
Yeah.
She applied for a job at a women's refuge,
The Vancouver Rape Crisis Centre.
a rape crisis centre, sure.
Yeah.
And they rejected her on the basis that she's trans.
No, on the basis they said you're a man and the women don't want you to be counselling them because they've been raped by men. They're traumatised and they're triggered by it. And
Sure.
they get to court, and the court agreed with the Vancouver Rape Crisis Centre. So I'm just wondering if you.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I'm not so in tune with Canadian law as I am with UK law, but yeah,
it's
that
not
seems
on the law. It's about that hypothetical situation. Let's have an English woman. Let's say Alex Drummond trains as a rape counsellor.
sure.
Do you think
That's fine. So, like, again, the only reason I make the reference to UK law is obviously you can differentiate between cis women and trans women, for example. You can differentiate based on sex in UK law where it's a means towards a legitimate aim. I think that's a really good example of that. I think that's probably fine. Like, it kind of sucks. I appreciate the optics of, like, I'm trans and I've been denied the job. I appreciate the optics and, like, yeah, sure. But this seems like one of those cases where that's absolutely fine. And if the judge threw the case out, that it suggests to me at least that Canadian law probably has something similar to UK law in that respect. Yeah. I think that's fine.
I'm really, really pleased to hear you say that, because I have to say, whenever I've tried to have this conversation on Twitter, I've been batted back with some really diminishing and sneering comments about the trauma of the women. So I think that's really good to hear you recognise that. And I suppose we come to the next point, which is that the laws which currently exist to allow that situation not to happen, my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is what trans rights activists want to do is remove those laws and operate purely from a system of self-identification. So Alex Drummond will come along and say, howdy do there, I'm a woman and I'm your rape counsellor for today. So it is.
I think I can speak to that, yeah. So I don't think that's really the predominant argument about self-ID. I've certainly never, like, if you've read the Equality Act 2010, like, I've read it cover to cover a few times, and it's definitely not perfect in the way it's written. Like, it seems to use gender and sex interchangeably. Like, it doesn't give clear definitions. By the way, just for the, oh God, that's my phone vibrating against my desk, sorry. Just to make clear, actually, the language I'm going to use here, just so that we're on the same page when I'm saying these things. I'm using gender to mean the sort of psychological, social concept, and sex to mean physiology. And also, when I'm referring to, like, men and women, male and female, I'll do the same thing. I'll use man and woman generally to refer to gender, like gender identity, and I'll use male and female because I think they're more kind of medicalized terms. You don't necessarily have to agree with that. I just wanted to make clear the language I'll use.
It's really helpful. I think you're right that it doesn't help the debate that both the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act are a hopeless muddle. And maybe that's one thing we can agree on, that we need.
Definitely. I think it's fair to say that the Equality Act 2010 needs a rewrite, even if that rewrite doesn't fundamentally change what it actually does. It should at least clarify things.
I agree.
But regarding self-ID, I don't think the argument for self-ID is, or at least certainly not for me and for trans people I've spoken to, which is a good number. It's not really the argument for the removal of that clause. I can give you examples for what it might refer to. So, for example, I'm trans. I'm on a waiting list for access to a GIC, which I've been on for quite some years. I would have probably had my first appointment around now if obviously coronavirus hadn't happened. But as it is, I'm probably going to be waiting at least another 6 months. And what I'll have to do is have my first meeting with them, wait possibly up to about 9 months for a second and a third. It's only after that third appointment that I'll get any treatment whatsoever. So, like, the wait for that is years and years and years.
Yeah.
And at the moment, if I tried to apply for a gender recognition certificate, I would have a really hard time because, for one thing, actually, this is another area of law that's really, really poorly defined. So if I have to get a gender recognition certificate, I have to live in my acquired for 2 years, live in my acquired gender for 2 years. And I think you'd be like, if you didn't know what that meant, I'd agree with you. And the thing is, there's no real formal guidance on what that actually means. There's really no consistency there whatsoever. And so what you end up doing is basically talking to a panel of people who are going to apply their personal idea of what gender is, which I think invariably ends up being stereotyping and ends up being kind of institutionally sexist. Like I've seen people discuss going to these hearings and they say like, wear a dress or wear a skirt, even if you don't normally, because these are the kind of things that, and it's ridiculous, right? That these are the standards that are being applied, but they are. And I think the push for self-ID is a push to get past things like that. So for example, I'm getting married. Again, I would have gotten married in a month, but coronavirus, so I'm probably getting married in October now. But I'm not actually getting married. I'm getting a civil union because I can't get married in the UK. Because if I get married, it'll legally be a gay marriage. And so my vows will have to say husband and husband. That's obviously a legal oversight. And it's one that I can resolve if I get a gender recognition certificate, except the only way I can get one of those is to satisfy a group of people that I've been living in my acquired gender for 2 years. And the only way I can reliably do that is to access a gender identity clinic that takes about 5 years and get onto healthcare. And then I've still got to jump through whatever kind of arbitrary hoops that the people that are going to judge my case are going to like decide. And then they still might say no, and then I still can't get married. That kind of frustration, I think, is what the self-ID argument is. I don't think it's saying, let's pretend that physiological sex doesn't exist or have any relevance whatsoever. I think it's saying the current process is not fit for purpose, and it's actually got like so much bureaucracy tied into it that we're very, very close to a point where more people are trying to access the process than the process is able to kick out on a daily basis, which means we're going to have the same problem as we do with trans healthcare rating lists.
Can we just
get longer and longer and longer and longer and longer? There is reform needed. Like,
I'm sorry that
the relevant laws are often really poorly defined, and I think the push for self-ID is a push to clear a lot of that out. Not like a push to pretend sex doesn't exist.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you could hear me.
But yeah, that's kind of my dilemma.
Can we bring Sarah in now to come back? That was a big chunk, a nice big chunk there.
I think it's really, really interesting, and I think this highlights the problem that we've got, because I don't think people like Ashley are the problem. And most people listening to that would feel hugely sympathetic and think, why the hell can't Ashley get married and say her vows as she wants? That's not hurting anybody. But the big elephant in the room, and I'd be interested to know what Ashley thinks about this, and I think this is why so many women are angry and afraid, is a lot of people putting themselves forward as trans rights activists don't have any such lovely motives, don't have any such stories of love and marriage and just wanting to get over the bureaucracy. The big thing, which I know makes a lot of women like me quite angry, is the overtly sexually fetishized way that some men approach this issue. They've got no intention ever of getting the chop, because part of the thrill appears to be parading around on Twitter in frilly knickers with their cock sticking out, if I may be blunt. I mean, the problem is, isn't it, is the Jessica Yeneves. And I'm not sure that I'm seeing people like Ashley speak up, well, at all. I was going to say loud enough, but really at all. Because these people seem to take a delight in taunting women and saying, you know, we're going to get self-ID, we'll be women. And we've got to be realistic. For a lot of them, it does seem to be about a sexual fetish. And a whole part of what makes it fun for them is the shock and horror that they can instill in women. I just wondered if Ashley agreed with that. You know, we've got a lot of people coming in under the trans umbrella and making it very difficult.
Sure. So Jessica Yeneve, I think is, I don't like to be absolutist about people, but I think a lot of Jessica Yeneve's behavior has been fairly monstrous. And I think that there's a lot going on with Jessica Yeneve that kind of reaches out beyond her identifying as trans. She, from what I understand, has used kind of the legal system to try and shut businesses down for the really quite arbitrary things. I'm definitely not a strong advocate of Jessica Yeneve. But this idea of being trans the fetish, it definitely exists. There are definitely people who identify as trans who see it as a fetish. Debbie Hayden's quite a well-known activist on the kind of gender critical end of this debate, who identifies herself as trans, and she wrote quite a long article about what she calls autogynephilia, or autogynephilia, I don't know how you pronounce it. Basically making the case that for her it is a fetish, was what I read from that. But I really don't think that that's representative of the community at large. It certainly hasn't been representative of trans people I've met. I've served as a trans representative in party politics. I've done it in student politics as well. When I was a bit younger, I've been around. You know, I've had a lot of contact with a lot of trans people, and this idea of being trans as a fetish, I certainly haven't perceived it to be remotely prevalent at all, like really at all. And the idea of trans women needing to get the chop, as you put it, there's problems there, right? So it's healthcare. It's hard to access. It's expensive, and it can be really quite dangerous. There are a lot of major blood vessels in there. There are a lot of potential complications, and also the recovery time is quite long. Depending on the type of surgery you have, you can be in recovery for months, up to a year. It's a very involved process, and I think for a lot of people, that is not really something they're willing or able to do. For example, if somebody has to work hand to mouth, as it were, if every paycheck they're getting is critical for their survival, then they can't really, or a lot of them just don't have the option to just spend a lot of money getting surgery and taking months and months and months off work to recover from it. It's a really hard process. And I think it's not entirely fair to make that the line in the sand or the standard, because...
Well, sorry, can I jump in there? Because I mean, I don't think you have answered my question, but you've answered it in this way. I've said, do you think it's a problem that there are these men who appear to be fetishizing it, and that's part of the thrill for them, and they're making women very angry and afraid? And your answer was, correct me if I'm wrong, you haven't seen that as prevalent, and you've been involved in trans activism. You don't see it as prevalent. Well, hopefully by now you can trust my good faith. You can trust that I've been around for a while as well. And I see it a lot, and it frightens me. Jessica Yaniv is not a one-off. I'm quite prepared to accept that she is a minority of trans women or people who call themselves trans women. But my question was, do you accept that trans people like you need to speak up more about men like that, because they're hurting you? They're a big part of why the anger and the fear is reaching a fever pitch on social media. They're a big part of why a conversation like this between you and I is so difficult, because really nothing much you've said I can object to. Of course I get it. Surgery is dangerous, expensive, difficult. I appreciate that you're going to be at the bottom of the priorities for the NHS. I totally get that. But
could I just interject quickly? Would that be okay? Just from listening to you both talk, obviously I've watched you both on Twitter to learn how you interact. And when you mention Jessica Yaniv, none of us, I imagine, from either side really want to take ownership of the worst examples of our kind. I'm wondering if both sides of this argument, and there are many more I'd love to raise you, hopefully we'll have time, but on the most superficial level, do you think that the way that we interact is based solely around the worst examples of both sides of this argument? Because I've heard nothing but reasoned conversation this evening. Yeah, I know that on Twitter,
on Twitter,
both of you can fall off that ledge pretty quickly.
I've had to rein myself in. When I started in 2011, and I hope I've got a lot better, but it's obvious that there is something that actually goes right into your brain. I was told it's like a meth addict. A bit of the brain that lights up when the meth addict sees meth is a bit of our brains that light up when we get a notification, when we get some kind of interaction. it's a powerful, powerful drug. And I've had to really rein myself in from just reacting angrily and violently. I do think Twitter, ironically, has brought us all together because, you know, when would we three ever have met and talked if social media hadn't brought us together? So hurrah for Twitter on that front. But yeah, you're quite right, Hayden. It is not fair or right or constructive to judge people by the worst examples. For example, you know, if I'm going to bring out Yaniv, then I'm sure Ashley could bring out Rose West. There you go, heterosexual woman. I do get that. But it is still an important point because Yaniv is not alone. Yaniv is absolutely the worst. But who am I seeing coming out and saying this is wrong? We don't support somebody trying to compel low-income immigrant women to touch a man's penis. And that's basically what he was trying to do.
Sure.
And I just wonder whether it's because also that Ashley is a younger person. I mean, that point that she made right at the beginning is spot on. The 70s and the 80s must seem like the dark ages to Ashley. And that is what's coming across in the debate, isn't it? You've got the teenagers, the 20-somethings squaring up against the middle-aged women like me. And it's about how we find a common language, and Twitter does not help. So that is probably a ramble, but I do think Twitter
Twitter is an outrage factory.
And what happened after the J.K. Rowling piece, I just thought encapsulated it all so horribly clearly. There were people saying, literally, I'm not going to read it. It's shit. Suck my dick. That was Wildian discourse. That was the high point. I mean, last night I just felt really despairing for humanity. But hopefully that is just Twitter. But Twitter is now really taken over, hasn't it? You've got the president of the United States who's using it as his bloody sounding board. I don't think we're going to escape Twitter. I'm just wondering how we can actually harness what is good about it. Certainly what's good about it is that we've been able to meet here tonight and talk, and Hayden's hosted it.
Yeah.
Could I just ask, we touched on earlier, obviously it's always toilets. It's the first place to start because it's the most emotive, it's the most immediate that we can all identify with. We can't all identify, thankfully, with rape crisis centres or, you know, top tier women's sports. You know, I know I'm making a terrible presumption about everybody in the room, and I don't think any of us would be amazing at that. When it comes to spaces that are sex segregated, sex separated either by law or by convention, where would that line be drawn? And I say this as a man, so I'm really not as emotional about it, obviously. But where is it? Because as far as I know, historically, the UK has been, out of most of the countries in the world, one of the most tolerant and forward-thinking on many trans issues. I'm not saying perfect, but certainly, you know, we've been more on the ball with that. And when the building that I'm in, when we've had trans people working here, no one's had a problem with the toilet because it was quite clearly a trans woman. But we automatically go to think of people like Drummond and think of that, you know, marching into a changing room, because again, we go to the worst things. But what spaces can we say, sorry, these are biological women's spaces, without the inevitable turf and the backlash and the fighting backwards and forwards? Surely there has to be a granular compromise of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that. So I've given quite a lot of kind of thought to this. So I play a sport for a women's team. I mean, I'm not on the team. I just practice with them. I'm not that good myself. And so, like, access to sports is certainly something that I've had to think about quite a lot. I'll go on to sports, and then I'll go on to prisons, and then I'll pass over. So for sports, I think, realistically speaking, the line between what I'm going to call average male performance and average female performance is different for different sports. For example, I think the performance difference in, say, darts or pool or like a dexterity sport is very different to, say, the difference in a combat sport like kickboxing. I don't really think it's a very sensible position to suggest that there's a one-size-fits-all answer for trans women accessing sports that are women's sports, or vice versa. So I think really the best angle there is to let individual sporting bodies decide. I'm not a sports scientist. I'm not an expert on every sport. But broadly speaking, individual sporting leagues are run by people who are one or both of those things. I really would trust independent sporting bodies to make their own judgments about how they want to interact with trans people. And equally, there's nothing really preventing people from creating new sports leagues. You know, if the dominant cricket league decides that anyone can play and it's inclusive of trans people in every direction, there's nothing stopping somebody from making a different one, and vice versa for sports going the other way. I think realistically, there isn't a perfect answer there, but probably that's the best one, because then you're leaving the decision down to the people most informed to make it, rather than just trying to mandate one way or the other, which I think is overly simplistic. I do think it's worth bearing in mind that because trans people make up a very low proportion of the population, suggesting a sort of segregationist, let's just have trans leagues idea, which I've seen suggested by some people, just really isn't that feasible. You know, there's in a lot of towns and cities, there's just about barely enough people to make a few teams to compete. And once you cut that down to the trans population, that's impossible. So they're really, whatever the solution is, it needs to include the potential for trans people to compete alongside cis people, and not just to be pushed into a different category, which is different to my view on prisons.
I mean, before prisons,
sure.
I'll just come back to Ashley on that, because I think, that sounds mostly really sensible. I'm quite prepared to accept that darts, for example, I can't see any particular advantage being a man or a woman, but we've got to bring it back to brass tacks.
Mm-hmm.
Because, look, the vast majority of men are bigger, stronger, and faster than the vast majority of women. I can say that as a categorical fact. I don't need to be a sports scientist. I don't want people coming at me, but hormones, that is a fact. I'm only as strong, for example, as a 60-year-old man. But anyway, and so those sports like track athletics, where men have an immediate and unfair advantage, and we're seeing that happening in Idaho now, where the state is passing laws to say that boys should not identify as women and run in those races. And yet you've got the American Union of Civil Liberties defending the position that girls should have to compete against biological boys or men. And, you know, and the response to those girls is, if you don't like it, you're bigots. Shut the fuck up, you transphobe. So, Ashley, while I commend your approach, which I think is sensible, do you agree with me that we've got some very heavy-hitting organisations who aren't sharing your view? And again, they are stoking up the fear and the resentment and the hatred. I'll own it. I think women are getting so angry and afraid. It is crystallizing into hatred, and it is coming out as transphobia. Sure. But this is what happens when people feel they're not listened to, as we can see all around us. Violence is the language of the unheard. So I'm just interested in what you think about the situation, say, in Idaho. Again, I'm not trying to quiz you on American law,
sure,
but girls who don't want to run track races against natal males be called bigots? Or is that something that you would allow in your categorization of sports?
Sure. So there's two things that I want to pick up on. One is the sort of relative strength or ability difference between men and women, but I'll come back to that. First thing is more directly your question about the ACLU and about people calling people bigots over expressing their opinions on this. I'm a really strong free speech advocate, and so I can't really reasonably say that I think that any particular organization or person shouldn't be allowed to express their views, and that goes both ways. I think people should be allowed to say, I don't want to do this, but I think also people are allowed to criticize them for it. So I don't really know what I can do there, because I
power imbalance between the American Union of Civil Liberties calling schoolgirls bigots. I mean,
I think if you take just the ACLU as an example, then sure, they're very powerful, but there are plenty of powerful figures espousing gender critical ideals. J.K. Rowling, who you referenced earlier, being a really good example. I don't think there's necessarily one side here that's got all the power figures or all the influence figures. I don't think that's.
Rowling isn't in a court fighting schoolgirls. I mean, I'm really troubled by this, because I get what you're saying about free speech. I applaud it. I support it. But as we had a brief exchange on Twitter before this started. Depends what you're trying to achieve, doesn't it? If you are just signaling your beliefs, then it's fine for the ACLU to do that. But there are children here who are being called effectively bigots. I don't think that's a free speech issue. That's, as Hayden said right at the beginning, that's an ideological issue. And I'm really troubled by that. And I still feel you're kind of dancing around the question which I posed. Do you think that there is a need? Do you think that the more moderate voices, the more thoughtful voices like yours, are you doing enough? Are you doing really anything to try and get this heard?
Yeah, I did want to talk about that, but we sort of moved past it slightly. So I really don't think that there should be an onus on people to divorce themselves of members of the community, because to me it smells a lot like Muslims being attacked after there's a terror attack that involves somebody who's a Muslim, and saying, well, why weren't you loud enough? Why didn't you decry this violence? Why aren't you standing on a podium saying, I want to separate myself from this person? Like, I don't think it's necessarily fair to expect people to expend their energy divorcing themselves of people who claim to be close to them. Like, for me, I think you should judge me by things I've said and by like the people I've expressly supported. I don't think it's really that fair. For example, Jessica Yaniv, I think it's fair to assume that I need to condemn her actions. Like, I've never supported her. I've never had any connection to her. I'm in the Green Party, so I hear this a lot about Amy Chandler.
Yeah, looking at your Twitter timeline, I mean, just what is difficult for me is that you like and you retweet things in the exact same language of the people who threatened me, doxed me, abused me, and harassed me. You know, evil turf, shut the fuck up. I'm not saying that it is your job to just go and bang a drum for moderate voices, but you are amplifying those voices which are hateful, and you are obscuring then your message. Do you think I've got a point about that?
Well, we were involved in a brief conversation on Twitter earlier where just before we went online here, somebody accused me of saying or retweeting somebody saying we are being erased and we should erase the people trying to erase us. And I asked them to quote that, and what they did was showed me retweeting Noelle Stevenson, who's a creator of a popular TV show, saying nothing of that sort, and then saying, well, the person below commented this, and if somebody's commented it below something you've retweeted, then you're supporting it. And it's like, it's ridiculous.
An open door. I think that is not helpful. I can understand what maybe motivates someone to do that, and I think it might not be malicious. They might just genuinely be so fired up. But I did look at your timeline, obviously, before we started, and you had retweeted stuff in exactly the same language.
I don't think I have. I don't think I've ever said any violent rhetoric. I don't think I've shared any violent rhetoric.
I think no. Well, hateful to it's interesting. Maybe I need to go back and have another look at it. Maybe I am oversensitive. Maybe I'm triggered. But I do think it would be really helpful if you and the other moderate voices could think about that distinction between actively trying to disassociate yourself and amplifying.
Well, here's the thing, though. I don't think I have amplified any violent rhetoric whatsoever. I certainly haven't amplified Jessica Yaniv, but even the less bad stuff. I don't think I've ever promoted any violent rhetoric. And what you've just said is that I've used the kind of language. Like, what is the kind of language? Because I have people messaging me telling me to kill myself. At the start of this conversation, when we first put this stream up, one of the first comments in a live comment was 42%. And I put a note in our little private chat just telling you two what that 42% means. It's quite a common dog whistle that's used to refer to an oft-cited suicide rate for trans people. People saying 42% are usually trying to signal, kill yourself, or ha ha ha, look how funny, people like you kill themselves very often. Like, I get that stuff all the time. I don't see people or expect people to distance themselves from that because I don't associate them with it. And I don't think it's fair to do it the other way around.
That is disgusting. And nobody should ever communicate to another person in that way. That is denying them their humanity. It's disgusting. But you see, I do disassociate myself from those people. I had an argument, with people I respect and admire about some of the language they use. I won't use the word true because it's distasteful. It's dehumanizing. I've had that conversation. I think that is my duty. That is my moral obligation as someone who's put themselves in this arena. I don't want to amplify that. because it's shit. It's horrible. Nobody should be telling you to kill yourself, or any other trans person. We've just completely lost our way as a species if that's the way we're going to conduct ourselves. But I don't know. I mean, maybe, you've got those triggers. I've got my triggers. If I see somebody retweeting effectively, shut the fuck up to, I find that violent and offensive and quite threatening, mainly just because I've seen it over and over, just as you have been threatened over and over.
I could agree with that. But again, I haven't retweeted anyone saying shut the fuck up, Turf.
Yeah, well, this is why I probably need to go back to your timeline, because that's what I came away with the impression. But yep, that might be my sensitivity and my triggering. Like,
I mean, if I have, hold me to account for it. But I don't think I ever have promoted any violent rhetoric.
I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know if this is a bit cheeky. Hayden will tell me if it is, but I'm looking at the time. I see we've only got about 14 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something else I wanted to talk about, because the two
Sure.
things that are very dear to my heart are
Mm-hmm.
self-ID, which I think we've actually had a really constructive talk about. But the other thing that really worries and concerns me is what's happening with children and the
Sure.
higher rates of
Definitely, we should talk about that, 100%.
So I'm just, obviously, what's coming up on the 7th and the 8th of October is Keira Bell's judicial review against the Tavistock. So I was just really interested to know what you thought. And first of all, I assume you're aware of the case and what her arguments are, and what you would like.
Fill me in on which case you're referring to, because I've seen quite a lot about the Tavistock.
Well, Keira Bell was somebody who says that she was encouraged to transition. She was a woman. They encouraged her. She's to transition to being a man, and
Sure.
she detransitioned. But it's
Sure.
obviously left its mark, because I think she had some quite powerful hormone treatment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So she's judicially reviewing the Tavistock, basically challenging the way in which they work with young people. And what she's effectively saying is, look, I needed somebody to talk to. I was confused and I was unhappy. But what I found was happening was I was pushed into transitioning. It wasn't right for me, and it's left irreversible signs on my body. So I just wondered what you thought about that, whether you think there is actually a push to transition young people when perhaps what they do need is more people to talk to than have medication or surgery.
Mm-hmm. So as far as pushing, like I'm not a Tavistock patient. I never will be. So I can't really speak to what any specific doctor in the Tavistock has said to their patients. But it's my understanding that the intent, at the very least, of trans healthcare is that it's very slow, very gradual, very much, are you sure? Do you want to go forwards with this? Are you sure? Do you want to go forwards with this? I had to have quite a lot of conversations with my GP just to get referred to a GIC. And even then, I've had a lot more conversations. I self-medicate with hormones. That's illegal. I've got them right here. Got that illegally. And I've spoken to my GP about that. And it's, a lot of discouragement. A lot, are you sure you want to do this? At no point has my GP ever encouraged me down any part of this line. It's been, are you sure? Are you sure you want to proceed with this? And here's the thing. To get access to the kind of healthcare you're talking about, like hormones, for example, or to get access to surgery, the life-changing stuff, to get access to that, you have to request it for years and years and years, and you have to ask for it over and over again. Now,
this is the problem, is that people are saying that is shifting. And certainly Keira Bell speaks to an experience where she did not have to jump those hoops and those hurdles. I mean, I'm just wondering, hypothetically, just if this is actually happening, and I appreciate what you're saying, sounds a long, painful and frustrating process, but would you agree with me that's got to be better than risking, say, a confused 16-year-old who may well be gay, being told, actually, no, you're not gay, you're a different sex, and we want to encourage you on this path of medication and surgery. I mean, would you agree with me that is something that we should all be concerned about?
Yeah, definitely. I think that if what you said is accurate, I think there should be an inquiry, and I don't think anybody should be saying you're not this, you're not that, you're probably this. That's not the way healthcare should really work in the UK, and I don't think it's the standard that is built into the GIC system. If somebody's done it, then I think they've done so against guidance and should be struck off the register, and I think appropriate action should be taken. But equally, I don't think the slowly process really is that great either. The fact that I've got stuff on my desk that I've had to buy illegally from Bulgaria because of these long waits, like, that's dangerous, and a lot of people are doing it. Like, I think that is also a symptom that probably these waiting lists are too long and that we need to do something about that. Probably the right answer is somewhere in the middle there. As far as 16-year-olds, though, and children specifically, it's my understanding that nobody can access this healthcare until they're a legal adult in the UK. And the thing is, when you're a legal adult, you can get anything done. You can get cosmetic surgery. You can have a nose job. You can have a facelift.
Actually, as you just said, you've just waved your bottle of illegal pills. You can get whatever the hell you want on the internet. You've got people like Dr. Helen Weberly prescribing powerful drugs to 12-year-olds. I mean, this is the problem. You've got Jazz Jennings, whose surgery to create a neo-vagina went horribly wrong because she was on puberty blockers. Her penis never developed. There wasn't enough skin.
Yeah, no, you're not supposed to be on blockers when you have the surgery. You're supposed to be off for 3 months.
You know, and I really worry about that because it's like her parents have monetized her. And
I do too.
So what you say, I mean, you're being completely reasonable and agree with a lot of what you say. But do you agree that there is a push? I mean, mermaids, for example, flying over to Thailand as a 16th birthday present. Thailand.
You're referring to somebody who is quite happy in mermaids, flew her daughter over to Thailand for surgery when she was 16.
Thailand, and the very next day was her 16th birthday, and she had surgery. Thailand then changed their laws to stop that happening. I mean, this is a problem, isn't it? That it is happening, and I think you agree with me that is worrying because you shouldn't be getting.
I don't think anybody should be having that kind of surgery at 16. It's incredibly dangerous because you're still undergoing puberty, you're still developing. There can be complications of the surgery, like for a breast augmentation in particular. Tissue is still growing. It's really dangerous to do stuff like that at 16. I would not advocate for that.
Well, I don't think actually I can have any more debate with Ashley because I think I agree with
like, I think once you're 18, do what you want. It's your body.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's really heartening to hear because again, and maybe it's just my sensitivity, but those voices of moderation appear to be being drowned out with the "I'd rather have a live trans kid than a dead kid." I mean, and certainly I'm a lawyer. What's really worried me is seeing how one High Court judge spoke about transitioning 4-year-olds. Now, I appreciate no one was talking about medication or surgery for a 4-year-old, but we're now in this situation where the High Court in this country is saying they've got no problem with a 4-year-old transitioning, even though this was the second child in a family, unrelated, because they were foster children, who had transitioned at a young age. Now, there's surely a risk, therefore, of environmental and social contagion. I refuse to accept that 2 children in one household, unrelated, would both want to transition at the age of 4. That to me smacks of something else that's going on, and it looks to me like. I mean,
like, so what does transition at the age of 4 really mean, though? So, for example, by sort of UK medical ethics standards, if for example a child at 4 expresses signs that they might be trans, the only thing that is to be done there, if anything, is okay, well, why don't we try a different name? Why don't we try referring to you with these pronouns? You can wear whatever you like. There's no permanent change there. I totally
accept no one was talking about drugs or surgery, but what worries people like me is there does seem to be a path of affirmation that charities like Mermaids are really pushing. So once that 4-year-old is on that path, I mean, in one particular case, it was against the advice of the school. They said, please don't do this. Please don't send this boy to school in a dress and with a changed name. Just you know, I totally agree. I think people should be allowed to wear what the hell they want, have their hair however they want. And I wonder whether ridiculous stereotypes that boys shouldn't have long hair is part of the problem. And if men were more willing to widen the bandwidth of men, to allow more feminine men to be welcomed and celebrated, I wonder if we would have less young children saying that they were trans. That is a very thing.
I think it's interesting because trans is obviously very, very broad, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, even within the community. And I think it would be fair to say, for example, that somebody who self-identifies as trans experiences dysphoria, wants to have surgery, wants access to hormones, versus somebody who identifies as trans who isn't any of those things. Both fine to me, both perfectly valid to me, but they are materially different, right? They have different needs. There's different endpoints there. I don't really know that it matters if somebody self-identifies as trans. I don't think that necessarily does put people on a pathway where they're more likely to access life-changing medical interventions. I mean, it's early days. There aren't any real longitudinal studies here about affirmation, but it seems at least a little presumptuous to necessarily think that vindicating people in this way, saying you can be what you want to be, change your name if you want, like, rather than just going, why don't you just try being a feminine man? I think both of those things are fine. I don't think either of them are harmful to the child. Like in this case where a school said, please don't change your child's name and send them to school and address, I imagine it was about concerns about bullying, which is a big problem in schools and definitely something that needs addressing.
There have been concerns that what was going on here was not something emanating from the child, but more a desire for whatever the parents were thinking. I mean, that I think is a worry, because we go back to the question of consent, and you quite rightly said, you know, this surgery should not be happening until you're able to give informed consent. So again, it's just part and parcel of the worries, because for me, as I've said, that the two main concerns are the self-ID, because I keep asking on Twitter, what's the test then? Tell me, when Alex Drummond walks into the room, how do I know that Alex Drummond is a true and honest trans woman and not a predatory male? What is the test? I mean, Ashley, can you help me with that?
Yeah. So give me a for instance here. Which room is hypothetical Alex Drummond walking into? Are we talking?
Well, we've had the problem with the issue with the toilets. I accept that's not an example that really helps most of us. So let's say it's a changing room at my local swimming pool, and I'm there with my 12-year-old daughter, and in walks Alex Drummond, and with his beard, and I think, well, what do I do? Do I challenge this person? They say, "Oh, I'm a trans woman."
What's the worst case scenario here? What's the nightmare situation that you're looking to avoid?
Well, what we see on Twitter, the nightmare situation is men wanting to use those situations basically to masturbate, to ejaculate, to terrify, possibly to go on to sexual abuse. That's the nightmare. That's what's in the back of a lot of women's minds. And I know a lot of men think, oh, you're just being hysterical. But a lot of women, as J.K. Rowling says, have got a sexual abuse incident in their history, and it is triggering. So what is the test? I
don't think there's any test that can actually work in any system. I think it's impossible. I think if you're concerned about that, the difference between that person walking into the changing rooms and the difference in the time difference between that person, this hypothetical male sexual predator, walking into a room and being challenged, and the point at which they would carry out a sexual assault or indecently expose themselves or otherwise commit some other crime of that nature, is potentially seconds. I don't know what the ability to challenge really prevents, because if somebody enters one of those spaces intending to do something illegal, then presumably they're going to do it, because people get challenged when they commit sexual assaults. People get challenged when they indecently expose themselves. It doesn't stop them. They're already there to do that thing. There's nothing out. There's nothing blocking that changing room. It's a door that somebody pushes open. So at the end of the day, I can't think, and I'd welcome it if you can, but I can't think, self-ID or otherwise, how you could prevent that from happening. I don't know how you can create a challenge.
We're talking about prevention, but sex segregated space.
I'm sorry, could I just jump in there, because I think we're going to miss a little thing that's really important there. I hope you don't mind me jumping in like this.
No.
When it's about stopping them, how do we stop them? How will we know what they're going to do? I think we're in a situation where if Alex Drummond was in this changing room, cock and balls out. Should we be a
little fairer to Alex and just make this a hypothetical male sexual predator?
This isn't a hypothetical Alex Drummond. I've got no idea what Alex is really like.
Let's leave Alex out of it and just go with a hypothetical sexual.
Okay, Dave. There's whatever the name is, bearded, male genitalia.
Yeah.
Might have the best intentions in the world. I think it's fair to assume that many of the women in the changing rooms would be alarmed.
That is fair.
Just your male genitalia on display. Now, you do rightly say, well, how do you know if they intend harm? Well, already we have a situation that's fractious at best. But now the women in those changing rooms, if someone walked in presenting very much as we think
looking
a
like
man
I
is,
say that.
okay, you would call the security guard. They would come in, they would take that person out of there and say, well, no. But if that person says, but I identify as a woman.
This is a great example.
We have a room full of uncomfortable people. How do we get past this?
So here's the problem. I can see a flip side to this story, though. Let's pretend we go full no self ID. Born woman, use women's toilets, use women's changing room. Born man, use male toilets and changing rooms. You go down that line. That same hypothetical predatory man, still looking like a man, you know, he's got a beard, whatever. Like people read him as a man. He walks into the women's changing rooms and somebody goes, well, now hang on, we don't have self ID. What the hell are you doing in here? You're clearly a man. And he goes, yeah, I'm a trans man. I have to use this toilet because that's what the rules are now. Like, you've got the same problem, right? That same hypothetical predator can still go into the women's toilets, still make a claim about being trans, and still effectively, without ID, which we've accepted is fairly impossible in these situations, is still allowed to be in there.
I as much as I don't want to insert myself, I do see your point there. I don't think that logically makes quite as much sense as presenting in the incorrect changing room. I do see what you mean, and I think
as women, historically, there have been sex segregated spaces to help reduce the risk. I take on board what is said, but it's not good enough to say, well, you can't stop yourself being raped and perved on.
I'm not saying that at all. No, I'm sorry.
That's a rude caricature of your argument, but that's why we have sex segregated spaces, so we can at least have that reassurance that we don't have to keep challenging people. Are you one of the nice ones with a penis?
How does the sex segregated space stop the man claiming to be a trans man?
Well, I don't. Trans men are a completely different prospect.
No, sorry. This hypothetical man isn't a trans man.
Very well, because testosterone is a mighty powerful hormone.
So I'm not talking about trans men. I'm sorry. What I'm saying is, if we have sex segregated spaces, somebody who is not a trans man, who is just a man who wants to go in and commit a sexual assault, in the sex segregated space, he can walk in and say, I'm a trans man. He's not a trans man. He's claiming to be a trans man, which explains his appearance. So he's still in.
Yeah, but this is why women want to keep spaces segregated by sex. The issue of the trans man, I think, is an interesting one.
No, sorry, I'm really sorry, Sarah. I'm really sorry. This isn't what I said.
Male spaces.
Isn't this more about how someone presents than anything else? A trans man, surely, there is a massive difference, isn't it? I think it's fair that, you know, if a trans man wants to use men's facilities, we don't care.
But that's,
you know, we all piss standing up chatting to each other. We don't care. But
but that wasn't my point. I wasn't talking about trans men. I was talking about how sex
pretending to be a trans man. But this is my point. Why would someone who appears to be a man with male genitalia be in the women's changing room any more than I think most women would say a trans woman with female appearing genitalia would not be viewed, I imagine, as a man, as much of a threat as someone that very much presents as a man.
So the thing is,
what it is.
I think you're right there, Hayden. The problem is that at that point, it becomes quite difficult to say what actually does looks like a man mean. It's very easy for us to paint this hypothetical big burly man with a beard who clearly looks like a man. But where does that line actually fall? At what point does somebody look masculine enough to challenge? That's a very gray area, I think.
I'm getting too involved. I think it's a very gray area if you want it to be. I think in real life, in everyday life, it's not perhaps that gray as we'd like it to be for the purposes of
You'd be surprised how many people struggle to identify. Like, I get read, depending on the day, as a man or as a woman in public. The idea that everyone innately knows.
Actually, I don't want to be harsh or unkind or unfair, but there is no way I would ever think you're a woman. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's not. But
your voice is a man's voice. Your face is a man's face. Your hands are a man's hands. That's why I called you he, and you had to call me.
That's fine, Sarah. That's fine.
And that is not meant to be rude or unpleasant or unkind. But I often hear this said, "How do you know? How do you know? You can't tell." But a lot of women have to be able to tell very quickly if someone is a man.
I agree with you, Sarah, but people can't, because every time somebody makes this claim, I send them I've got a big list of 20 images of different people. I say, tell me the men, tell me the women. Nobody's ever got it right.
Come on, a photo doesn't cut it. I could put a filter on my bloody phone that makes me look like a really manly man.
Sure, but
cut it.
Sarah, my lived experience is that people
your voice is a man's voice. Anyone listening to your voice.
Right, I think we're just starting to talk over each other a little bit as we get into the... We've been on a while. It's getting exciting. I know we're all loosening up. Let's give everyone a little bit, because we've done really well so far. Let's see if we can make it to the end without blood being shed.
I didn't want to be rude or offensive to Ashley, but I don't. It's often an argument that's chucked back at me. You don't know, you can't tell. I mean, to be fair, dudes, I watched videos of Blair White. Looks like a beautiful woman. But I think these people are really rare. And that's the massive problem with the whole trans issue. Men who successfully pass as women are vanishingly rare.
Sarah, I'd like to speak to that.
Stumbling block for the whole movement.
Sarah, I'd like to speak to that if I could.
Yeah, of course.
If you see somebody out in public who you can tell is trans, like you can say to yourself, that person is, I think, probably a trans woman. Like, I can tell that they're not a cis woman, they're not born female. You can clock that in your head. You can have a little counter. Boop, that's one person that I've clocked. That's one person that I've noticed. If you see a trans woman in public who does pass, who you don't read as a man, you don't clock it. So how can you know how many trans women you've seen in public? Because like you say, pictures don't cut it. So we're talking about face-to-face in public. How can you possibly give a reliable reading? Because that's like saying, I can see 100% of visible people and I can see 50% of invisible people.
That's a really fair point. But you just said to me that when you're out and about, that it's kind of 50-50. People say...
I didn't say that. I didn't say it's 50-50.
Sorry. What I see on Twitter, for example, of course, I go down the street. You're absolutely right. It could be every other person I pass is a successfully passing trans woman. But you just said right at the beginning of this debate that there's very few of you. You're very small in number. There's no point in having your own sports league. Sure. I have that. My perception, and I think this is shared by the majority of people, is it is quite difficult for most men to pass convincingly as a woman. And this is part of the massive problem. And that is why people are so angry and why this is all about compulsion, why people are saying, shut the fuck up, TERF. Because it's about dissonance, isn't it? And
this comes down to lived experience, really, I think. Like, there isn't really a very easy answer. Yeah, a study could be conducted, and I could probably design a study that might test this, but I don't think anyone's interested in funding that right now. But it's very hard to get reliable data. My experience is people have read me both ways. And my experience with a lot of my trans friends is similar. And here's the thing. I don't want to say that your opinion is any worse than my opinion, because we're both just two very small data points in what needs to be a much larger collation of data. But when you walk past somebody and clock them or don't clock them, you don't know automatically unless you've clocked them. Then maybe you do. But when I'm out with my trans friends, I know that they're trans. And so I notice when they don't get clocked. I notice when they get passed. I notice when they get gendered correctly according to their identity by people who don't know them. And it's really frequent. So I don't know that this idea that we can always tell actually really stands up to any scrutiny.
Well, that's perhaps something that we will need to conduct a better study on, because that, again, is another stumbling block in the debate.
So it is, yeah.
I see a lot of men on Twitter saying you'd never tell. And even on the tiny little Twitter avatar, you can tell.
Yeah, I agree. But I don't think there's any way to make a decisive statement there, realistically. We're just both speaking from personal opinion. I don't think it's fair to say we can always tell. And I don't think it's fair to say you can never tell.
Right. Well, I've got to admit, I thought this went far better than I thought it might. But also a part of me, when I've been at gatherings from people that have previously only known each other online, you always find that when you are face to face, you tend to look for the common ground a lot more than desperately trying to take the higher ground. The purpose of tonight was not to decide a winner and a loser.
No.
It was to see if we could talk from what seemingly seemed completely opposing positions, and hopefully it's something we can do a little more often. Because if any good's going to come of this, people are going to have to talk. We've got to stop letting and I know I introduced you as a trans activist.
Sure.
But we have to stop the Twitter activists leading the conversation.
I think
shooting down everybody. And I mean this on both sides. We instantly attack. I've seen it in chat here. I see it on Twitter, for example, where Ashley's concerned. Well, you're a man. A needless attack, pointless. It's Twitter speak. With Sarah, shut up, turf. That just shuts down conversation. And I think that the most detrimental thing to the trans community and trans cause will certainly not be WeAreFairCop or Sarah. It won't be Glinner. It will be the activists. Because society historically reaches a point where it pushes back. This is not being said as a threat or it'll be a pogrom, but people become resistant instead of tolerant. They stop trying to understand. I think the more we let the activists rule, the less we will have chances to talk as we have today. Because much as Ashley was told not to take part in this debate because somehow it'd be terrible, because I am a complete asshole on Twitter. I am a shocking asshole on Twitter and on this show. But there's a time, there's a place. I'm not going to do it with you. I'm certainly not going to do that with Sarah. So I hope, if anything, we all knew this was feasible, but I hope, if anything, anyone watching it realizes that even vastly different people, if we just stop being assholes just for a minute, just for 1 minute, and realize that we are not defined by the bloke that just hates trannies, and that trans people are not defined by Jessica Yaniv. By the way, I have to be very careful when I mention Jessica Yaniv. We've had a couple of bans because I've mentioned Jessica Yaniv. Really? Yeah. I describe Jessica Yaniv as what Jessica Yaniv is, and apparently that's not good. So I'll tell you after. Don't worry.
Sure, yeah.
I'll tell you afterwards. No problem. But guys, I think because Sarah, you did have something you had to do, didn't you?
Yeah, I've got to head off in 15 minutes. But if there were any questions or anything, I'm happy to.
That's what I was going to suggest. If anybody has any questions for Ashley or Sarah, please pop them in chat. If they see them, great, they can pounce on them. We'll try and get them on the screen, or Graham will try and catch them. He's doing his best with his broken arm. He's got a broken arm. He doesn't like to talk about it. He has a broken arm.
Seems like you like to talk about it.
No, he doesn't like to talk about it, doesn't he? He doesn't want the sympathy. He wants the sympathy. So let's have a look. Let's see what we've got in here, if there are any questions, because I've been listening, so I've not been paying any attention. Sorry, guys, I really haven't. Yeah. Okay, that's more of a statement, but okay, because let's bring some in. This is can you pop that one up, Graham? Go on, you can do it. There we go.
Oh, wow.
This is from Jessica 12 UKE. I hope that's not your age. This is not the show for you. We have our rights. There are no new reasons for our rights going because of a tiny handful of men who want to be women. A very common thing that's put forward. So, Ashley, have it.
Yeah, sure. Leaving aside the tiny handful of men who want to be women comment, because it's, I think, a little cruel and also completely ignores that trans men are a thing, but leave that aside. It's quite easy to say everything's fine, we've got all the rights we need, when you're not a member of the group that's asking for your rights. People said that when people were asking to get rid of segregation. People said that when women were asking for the vote. The status quo is fine, leave it alone. I think it's a bit of a ridiculous argument, to be honest. Like, I gave quite a good example earlier of how there's a massive legislative gap that screws over my attempt to get married. Like, there are clearly, observably gaps. Even if you don't think that trans rights should have any relation to women's rights, even if you think trans people should be in completely different spaces, there are still fundamental gaps in trans rights that need addressing.
I, for one, would like to see them shouted about a bit more, so I would know more about them instead of it being a constant battle between trans activists and women's rights. You know, it seems that our focus is on one thing, and there might be a lack of understanding on that side of things. I mean, obviously, as you know, Jessica's still saying that we aren't going to find a solution tonight.
Understanding, and it's interesting. I'm a woman here, and I know Ashley presents as a woman. You're a man. The difference why women's rights are so sensitive is that women for millennia have been oppressed on the basis of their sex. Around the world now, people have no problem knowing which are the female fetuses to abort, to the female children who are killed in honor killings. Women's rights are something entirely different to Ashley's right to get the proper medication. I'm not sneering at that or saying it's not important. It is. But qualitatively, substantively, it doesn't come close to what we are saying about the need for women to be protected on the basis of their sex, which is the basis of their oppression over thousands of years. And this is why women are getting so angry, because men just don't get that. Why should you? My mum in 1973, when I was born, had to get my dad's signature to buy a washing machine on hire purchase. That's 1973, because she was married to him. She didn't have the status. That's within a time I was alive. So I think unless people like Ashley can get a bit more tuned into the 70s and the 80s and what was happening there, we are going to have this divide in this gulf. Women's rights to be protected, single-sex spaces, are not the same as Ashley's right to get a timely delivery of medication, although I appreciate that is something that he should get. I don't think you should have to, Ashley, be getting stuff on the internet. I think that is wrong and unhelpful. But it's nothing like my mum being told, you're not a person because you've got a vagina. Where's your husband, dear? Nothing.
Oh yeah, Sarah, just so you know, I know you weren't making any accusations there in any way, but my point was I didn't know what other rights were an issue for trans people, because the only one I hear is about, you know, access to
well, I hope
spaces.
you answer that, because what I think is happening is some of these, I don't want to diminish them, I'm trying to think of a word, some of these procedural, administrative rights that trans people lack, and I accept on Ash's example they do, are being used as a reason to beat down the substantive rights gained over time to protect women from oppression by their sex. This troubles me. This is a big part of why this debate will often stall. Sorry, I was answering that question. I think there are obstacles in the way to trans people living their best lives. I think Ashley's example of marriage is a very good one. Absolutely, that is wrong. No society should be putting obstacles in the way of two people who love one another making their vows. Ashley getting married doesn't impact on me. It just makes me happy that two people who love one another have found each other. But that can't be used as a reason to kick down the door that protects women on the basis of their sex. That's what troubles me. I think it's the difference between, say, administrative procedural rights and a massive, big, fuck-off substantial right. So that, I think, is where the debate needs to now progress, because that is a stumbling block. That's what's holding us back.
I think that's the one we'll probably have to fix next time then, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We'll sort that out. We'll get it sorted. We can do that. We fix things on this program all the time. We fix the Middle East problem. They haven't caught up with it.
It doesn't look solved to me.
Oh no, it's just they're taking a while to catch up. It just takes a while. Don't worry. Couple of generations, they'll have it sorted. Are there any more questions that have popped up?
It's mostly the what rights don't you have? No.
Yeah.
Somebody's been kind enough to tell me that my fiance is probably buggering a real woman now. That's nice. Nice.
Well, that's just shit. And people like that
someone
They're
being
not-
a complete and utter
They're
asshole.
not
Yeah, God.
advancing the human species.
I think we could all agree that cup of tea is a piece of shit.
I think there's also times though. There's also times I think we all have to accept as well. Sometimes people are just being dicks for being dicks. They don't wish any harm, and we because we're all the center of our own universes. We do certainly take things on board a little more than perhaps we always should. I think I honestly believe, being an old boomer myself, I believe we're really not very good at walking shit off now. You know, we really do sweat the small stuff, which is why the big stuff remains insurmountable at all times, because we're so busy being, you know, bothered by everything else. We are going to have to bring this to a close, sadly. I do hope we get to do this again, though. I do hope we get to keep a dialogue going. Bring you guys on, bring other people on. You know, every once in a while, touch base. You know, go on your own, talk about things. I think that'd be really.
Well,
I don't know about you.
On in the legal front, I mean, there's the whole Kira Bell thing. Harry Miller's case is going to the Supreme Court, so there's going to be a lot to talk about. Hopefully, after lockdown, when these matters finally start going through the court. So I'd be more than happy to come back and have a chat about that.
That'd be wonderful. I think it's a great way of keeping it going, and also you'll both get dog's abuse for coming on such a dreadful gammon show. So that's fantastic as well. But thank you for using our platform and trusting us to
well, thank you
provide it.
Yeah, thank you for moderating. I think you've done a good job.
I think it's been really interesting. I've genuinely enjoyed it, and I look forward to doing it again. I know I'll be chatting to you on Twitter after anyway. Why we're pretending like this is a long goodbye? But listen,
well,
thank
I've
you
got to
so
get
much.
into a car now, so I'm not blanking anyone or running away. I would love to.
You're totally ghosting us.
I'd say thank you very much to Hayden for hosting, and thank you very much to Ashley for talking. So I would love to see you on Twitter, but I'm going to have to go off grid now for about an hour. So I'm not running away. I'm just...
Catch you later. Take care, Sarah.
Yeah.
All right. See you later.
Ashley, all the very best. Sarah, thank you. Right, Josh, just pop me up the front because what we're going to do. What time is it? It's